ranking 13 different versions of Dracula's brides. Since it's officially spooky season, what better way is there to get into the holiday spirit than by talking about one of the most iconic horror villains of all time, or his wives to be more exact. In Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, a trio of beautiful vampires serve as secondary antagonists, being referred to as, quote, those weird sisters. Their relation to the Count and to each other is hotly debated to this day, with some saying that Stoker intended for them to be Dracula's relatives, his sisters or daughters potentially, while others have said the sisterhood is merely their vampire existence. Whatever the case may be, in modern times they're usually depicted as Dracula's brides, and over the years there have been dozens of different interpretations, some more interesting than others. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at 13 different versions of Dracula's brides in no particular order. Then I'll rank them. I'll be discussing their role in the story, how they differ from other iterations, and whether or not I'd ignore all of their red flags. But first, a few disclaimers. Now, Dracula has had a lot of love interests over the years, but for this video, we're going to be focusing on the trio of women who act as his consorts. That's a group of 3, no more, no less. And although the groom doesn't have to be Dracula specifically, he does have to be Dracula coded, meaning random polygamous vampires don't count. Because of the sheer amount of vampire movies over the years, I'm omitting some of the less notable takes on the characters, but I promise you're not missing out. And because it has to be said, this is my opinion, so it's totally fine if you disagree, just don't be an asshole about it. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. Dracula. The first adaptation of the novel was sound. 1931's Dracula is notable for its lasting impact on the vampire archetype in film, with actor Bela Lugosi depicting the iconic character with a thick accent and a flair for the dramatic, which has been parodied numerous times over the years. The original story begins with Jonathan Harker being sent to Dracula's castle to assist him with purchasing a house in London, where he's subsequently attacked by the 3 vampire women, who greatly weaken him before he's able to make an escape. Renfield is later introduced as an inmate at a London asylum who's taken to eating bugs, rats, and birds in an attempt to steal their life force. In the 1931 film, Renfield is the one who visits Transylvania instead of Jonathan, but the events unfold in a similar fashion. Dracula and his brides are first shown waking from their slumber, with all 4 emerging from coffins in the crypt beneath the castle. The brides reappear after Renfield takes ill following Dracula's hypnotism, with the 3 attempting to feed on him before being stopped by their master. They're not nearly as giggly as their book counterparts, and with their long white dresses and reserved demeanor, the women come across as mysterious and eerie, almost like ghosts. This restraint makes them all the more terrifying, as they're less like rabid dogs and more like snakes who are waiting for the chance to strike. This patience is also a bit more human, creating a sense of vulnerability that highlights the loneliness of their existence. We also get some insight into their relationship with Dracula, which is more subservient, as they don't even attempt to resist his orders. The film follows the novel's description of 1 blonde and 2 brunettes, and I've got to respect the blatant 1930s styling of their hair and makeup, which is dramatic but also desirable, hinting at their seductive nature in the novel. Mystery and imagination. Although Dracula movies continued to be immensely popular, with multiple female vampires being introduced as antagonists, the 3 brides wouldn't make a reappearance for several decades, with one of the next examples coming from a 1968 episode of the British anthology teleplay series Mystery and Imagination. In this adaptation, a mysterious asylum patient is hypnotized by Dr. Van Helsing, causing him to recount a series of traumatic events in Transylvania, eventually revealing himself to be the missing Jonathan Harker. In this flashback, Jonathan is exploring Count Dracula's castle when he meets the brides, who are more feral than their 1931 counterparts, climbing on furniture, licking their lips, and snarling in his face. Their appearance is similarly wild, with matted hair and a mouth full of sharp teeth instead of the usual 2. Once again, Dracula asserts his dominance, telling them that Jonathan is his, but because all they do is pant and snarl, they just wind up looking like his misbehaving pets instead of his lovers.
I command you! He is mine.
I know Jonathan is under Dracula's spell, so he isn't really registering everything going on around him, but these girls are acting strange enough that you'd think he'd have a slightly bigger reaction. This version is unique for having the first black bride, which is still uncommon to see today, but otherwise, there's nothing notable about this depiction of the characters. Sure, they're scary, but in a generic way that lacks any charm, and if I saw them, I'd simply turn around and walk the other way. Count Dracula. It wasn't until the 1970s that the brides were finally given dialogue, giving them a bit more personality than prior iterations. In the film, Jonathan Harker awakens to find himself in a crypt, with the three brides discussing which of them will get to taste him first. This is interrupted by Dracula, who stakes his claim on Jonathan, which one of the brides actually challenges, saying that they found him first. They're finally persuaded to leave him be after Dracula offers them an infant to feed on instead. Later, when Jonathan is roaming around the castle, he finds Dracula and the brides asleep in their coffins, prompting him to escape by jumping out a window into the river below. At the time, this was one of the more faithful adaptations of the source material, with the brides' dialogue being pulled directly from the novel. This gives them a bit more personality, and we can understand not only their relationship to each other, but also to the Count. There's clearly a hierarchy, with the blonde bride being given the right to Jonathan's blood first, implying that the women have a sense of respect for one another. We can also see that unlike some of the other brides, who cower in fear of Dracula, these ones are willing to stand up to him. Now their tone is a bit spoiled, so it makes sense for Dracula to pacify them with a gift, a dynamic many couples can still relate to today. Although feeding on a baby should make them absolutely terrifying, they basically just go over to inspect it, then run off, so the moment doesn't really land. Although it's a deviation from the novel, I do think it's interesting how the trio are an early example of the blonde, brunette, redhead trope, which has persisted to this day as an instant identifier. With their flowy dresses and luscious hair, they look like they came straight out of a gothic romance novel, and I would probably wind up staying for a drink. Jonathan. Our first film to be merely inspired by the characters in Dracula, 1970's Jonathan takes place in a world where vampires, who are immune to sunlight, have taken over the world, turning them into the ruling class, where they use humans as food or servants. Fed up with this miserable existence, a group of human rebels band together to track down the leader of the undead and destroy him. Although he's referred to only as the Count, there's enough similarities between him and Dracula that we can assume they're meant to be one and the same. Instead of a near-empty castle, the Count now rules over an entire coven, and we gain a greater understanding of how their society functions. For example, we actually see the Count turn one of his brides from human to vampire, with the process being represented as romantic and intimate, making their relationship seem more like that of a husband and wife than in other films. This is important later on when he stops them from feeding on Jonathan, with the brides angrily sulking and repeating a line from the novel, saying that the Count never loved them. This implied loneliness and unhappiness changes the context of their attack on Jonathan, making it more of an act of desire than hunger. Like other adaptations, the Count gives them a child to placate them, but instead of framing it as a tasty snack, it's set up more like they're starting a family, with one of the brides later singing the child a lullaby and rocking him to sleep. We see the brides again when the humans invade the castle, begging for the Count to save them, only for it to be too late, and they're chased into the sea and drowned alongside the rest of their vampire family. All of the vampires in this film have a fun look, with the Count opting for a stereotypical Dracula cape, the normal members of the coven wearing red, and the vampire children wearing purple. With their white gowns and floral headdresses, the brides certainly look bridal, but I like that their makeup is a bit more undead than glam. Count Dracula's Great Love. Another deviation from the usual formula, in this film, Dracula, who is masquerading as Dr. Wendell Marlowe, is looking for a virgin sacrifice to resurrect his dead daughter. After their stagecoach breaks down, 4 young women and their male companion are stranded in the middle of nowhere, forcing them to take shelter in Dracula's castle. One by one, each of the guests fall under Dracula's spell and are turned into vampires, all except the virginal Karen, who Dracula falls in love with, choosing to kill himself instead of cursing her to a life of eternal damnation. This is the first film to give the brides names, Senta, Elka, and Marlena, which is reflective of their larger role in the story. In both their human and vampire forms, they're flashy and flirtatious, although there are a few minor differences in their individual personalities, with Senta being the bossy leader, Elka being her sassy sidekick, and Marlena being nothing but a sex kitten. This is obviously done to make Karen appear more sweet and virtuous in comparison, while also making their eventual outcome a punishment for their unladylike behavior. Although Dracula hasn't always been nice to his brides in the past, this is the first time he actually kills them, putting a stake through one's heart after she attempts to feed on Karen, and exposing the other two to sunlight. Even though their sexuality is the primary focus, these brides show more independence than most, actually leaving the castle on their own to hunt and disobeying direct orders. They're also a bit more sadistic, killing villagers with farming equipment and helping Dracula torture another young woman. Although they have a good deal of personality at first, they're in more of an animalistic dazed state as vampires, really only caring about quenching their thirst, which is a shame because I think it could have made their dynamic even more interesting. The girls wear vaguely Victorian dresses, combined with distinctly 1970s nightgowns, and I like that the different looks make the brides individuals instead of just lumping them together. Plus, it's one of the few times we actually see them wear color. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Released in 1974, this made-for-TV adaptation was somewhat faithful to the source material, save for a few dramatic deviations. As they often do, the brides start off silent before descending into a series of hisses and growls, and they're promptly thrown aside by Dracula, who chastises them for having the nerve to feed on his guest.
How dare you touch him, any of you!
After his attempts to murder Dracula fail, Jonathan is thrown into the castle's crypt, where the brides finally get to feed on him, keeping him busy while Dracula heads to London. We don't see the brides again until the very end of the film, where they're killed by Van Helsing in their coffins, along with the now vampire Jonathan. The film's inability to decide if the bride should be sexy or scary leaves them in this weird middle ground that winds up feeling goofy, and there's nothing about them that's very unique, not even their wardrobe. Count Dracula. This 1977 BBC adaptation is one of the first films to give the brides their characterization from the novel, namely their girlishness, which is used to lull Jonathan into a false sense of security. Instead of attacking him out of the blue, they use their beauty as a tool of seduction, making it feel more like a romantic rendezvous than a vicious assault. This romantic undertone is present in their relationship with Dracula as well, who is more gentle and affectionate towards them. And honestly, this is the first movie where I'm sold on the group's physical and emotional intimacy, which is impressive, considering some of the other brides have literally been naked in bed together.
Don't look at him. Leave him. Back. Back.
I need him for a while. Then you shall have him. He will be yours. All yours.
In this film, they seem so normal at first that you almost forget that they're vicious killers, until they start feeding on the infant Dracula gives them, of course, which for once isn't just implied, but shown, with blood dripping down their chins and their eyes turning red. It's a great juxtaposition of their initial sweetness, helping us understand why Jonathan was so easily swayed. The brides are later seen sleeping in their coffins, prompting Jonathan to flee from the castle, and we don't see them again until they attack Van Helsing and Mina in the forest. Initially welcoming their new vampire sister with open arms, this curiosity turns into anger when Van Helsing holds off their advances. The following day, while they're asleep, Van Helsing proceeds to drive a stake through their hearts, killing them. These brides are a lot more formidable than their predecessors, having the power to put their victims into a trance-like state, being inhumanly strong, and having the ability to fly. Not to mention that by seducing their targets instead of snarling at them, their success rate feels like it'd be a lot higher. Or at least it'd work on me. Although they're all in the usual bridal white, I like that each of their dresses is just a tiny bit different, as if implying that they were all turned at different points in time, and I would happily wear any of these outfits. The Monster Squad. Aimed at a younger crowd, the Monster Squad follows a group of tweens who attempt to stop an army of iconic monsters led by Count Dracula from taking over the world. Dracula's brides make an appearance in the film, but unlike the rest of the monsters, aren't magically brought to life, but are transformed by Dracula himself from a trio of normal human girls. The three don't really do much except chase after the children and growl at them, making them some of the least frightening villains in the film. I do feel bad for them when they're killed though, not because they were remotely interesting, but because for all intents and purposes, they were innocent. And maybe the Monster Squad could have found a way to turn them back into humans, instead of, murdering them in cold blood. Transylvania Twist. A parody of the horror genre, one of the twists in this film is that Count Byron Orlok, the film's faux Dracula, no longer has a trio of brides, but 3 adopted daughters instead. Taking their names from the singing Andrews sisters, Patty, Laverne, and Maxine mainly appear in hypersexual gags, although Patty is given a larger role than the rest, making her their undeniable leader.
It's Lord Orlok. He keeps me locked in this castle. He's taken everything away. My freedom, my vibrator, my traveler's checks.
She regularly tricks unassuming men by acting as a damsel in distress, but before she can seal the deal and sink her teeth into one of the castle's guests, the Count puts an end to it, although in a more humorous manner than usual by grounding her and scolding her for spoiling her dinner. Patty's also a bit of a prankster, nearly dropping a chandelier on one person and joking about everything being a dream with another. The three characters' sexuality is a bigger focus than their thirst for blood, and they spend the entire film running around in lingerie and vaguely BDSM-esque outfits. Sure, they look good, but they're so goofy that I'd probably get bored pretty quickly. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Francis Ford Coppola's take on Dracula is remembered for a lot of reasons, one of which is its depiction of the brides, who were basically evil incarnate. The film isn't subtle when it comes to their sexuality, but their escapades come across as sadistic instead of romantic, making them a good deal more terrifying than other interpretations. Their demonic nature is solidified in how they crawl across the ceiling, calling back to The Exorcist, and they manage to be so creepy that you even forget how gorgeous they are. Their relationship with Dracula is clearly defined, with him seeing them as nothing more than a way to numb the pain of losing his true love, which leaves them desperate for affection. But for once, I don't really pity them. They attempt to get Mina away from Van Helsing by hypnotizing her, but he's able to bring her back to her senses, angering the brides, who then try a physical attack, only to be repelled. The following day, Van Helsing finds the brides asleep in their chamber, where he promptly chops off their heads. These brides dress in an ancient fashion that looks vaguely Grecian, alluding to their old age. But as fabulous as it is, it doesn't really make sense considering the earliest they would have been turned is the late 1400s. But I get it, they wanted them to look totally different from the rest of the female characters. This lineup is pretty iconic for its inclusion of Monica Bellucci, who at the time of filming was just getting started in the acting industry. But if it weren't for that, I do wonder if these brides would be as well known today. Don't get me wrong, they're probably the scariest version to date, but that's really all there is to them. Dracula 2000. Intended to serve as an unofficial sequel to the original story, the film follows Count Dracula after he's resurrected in a 21st century world. After awakening, Dracula proceeds to seduce and turn several young women into vampires, including Van Helsing's secretary Selina, a TV reporter Valerie, and college student Lucy, who all become his new brides. The group proceed to cause havoc in New Orleans, where they eventually corner Van Helsing, who they kill with an ironic stake through the neck, but his death is later avenged by his apprentice Simon and his daughter Mary. As humans, each of the girls have different personalities, with Valerie being confident and friendly, Selina materialistic and demanding, and Lucy sweet and gentle. But once in their vampire form, they're more cold-hearted, only caring about what will make their master happy. However, they do seem to enjoy the hunt, toying with their victims like a cat with a mouse. With their kung fu moves and snide comments, they're more cheesy than they are scary, and I just can't take them seriously as antagonists. Even their flirting feels forced, to the point that it's not even flirting anymore. Being hot can only take you so far. Van Helsing. In 2004, Universal Pictures wanted to put a spin on the classic Dracula story by taking it in a more action-driven direction that had proven popular over the years with films like Pirates of the Caribbean, Spider-Man, and Resident Evil. This led to the creation of Van Helsing, which took the character from Bram Stoker's novel and turned him into a flamboyant monster hunter who works for a secret organization. With Dracula and his brides terrorizing Transylvania, Van Helsing is sent to vanquish them, where he meets Anna Valerius, the last surviving member of an ancient Romanian family that has been battling Dracula for centuries. When Van Helsing arrives in Transylvania, we immediately meet the three brides, Verona, Marischka, and Alira, with Marischka being slain during the ensuing battle, much to the horror of her fellow vampires. It's revealed that Dracula's plan is to bring his undead children to life, something his brides are both excited but anxious about, as prior attempts have brought nothing but heartache. In another battle, Alira manages to kidnap Anna, although Verona is killed in the process, bringing Dracula's bride count down to 1, but his attempts to persuade Anna to join him are coldly rebuffed. In the group's final battle, Anna and Alira finally duke it out. Although the vampire initially seems to have it in the bag, Anna is able to kill her with some much needed help, and with that, Dracula is left brideless. Because the brides have a pretty big role in the film, their characterization was actually thought through, and I think that their personalities and motivations wind up being a lot more interesting than Anna's. Although Verona is implied to be the leader, as she's often seen ordering the other two around, the group are rather affectionate with one another. And this closeness is also highlighted by their spiritual connection, with the vampires being able to sense when one of the others has been killed. One thing I really like about the film's take on the vampires is their ability to transform into large bat-like creatures, and although the CGI is a bit iffy today, the effect of their clothing turning into their wings is really cool. Plus, I like how it ties into their seductive past, with them having a more approachable appearance that is used to hide the monster within. Overall, the brides in this film have really big, "we saw you from across the bar" energy, but you know what? I'm not complaining. The Invitation. Another unconventional take on the Dracula story, The Invitation follows Evie Jackson, who after taking a DNA test, discovers she has an entire family that she was never told about. She ventures to England to reunite with them at a wedding, where she meets Walter Deville, the mysterious owner of the manor they'll all be staying at. Evie meets the rest of the guests, including the two maids of honor, Lucy and Victoria, as well as Walter's devoted servant, Mr. Field. She eventually develops an attraction to Walter, but it's later revealed that he's actually Dracula, and he intends to marry her to have her take the place of her ancestor. He succeeds in transforming her into a vampire, but Evie uses this newfound strength to attack him, successfully killing him and turning herself back into a human. The three brides in this film are Emmeline, Evie's ancestor, Lucy, and Victoria. Although she's only seen in the opening sequence, we learn a good deal about Emmeline throughout the story, discovering that she killed herself after losing the love of her life and the guilt of becoming a cold-blooded murderer. While Victoria is just a random noblewoman that Dracula had turned into a vampire, Lucy is the same character from the novel. Victoria is the more cold-hearted of the two, being jealous of Evie and treating her with condescension the moment she arrives. Lucy, on the other hand, is kinder, hoping that she and Evie could grow as close as she and Emmeline had once been. While Victoria shows little remorse for her victims, Lucy finds herself siding with humans at the end, saving Evie by impaling herself and Victoria on a pike. While the film itself is a bit predictable, I like that we get to see something different from the brides, with some of them still holding on to their humanity. It makes sense that some people wouldn't be too happy with themselves after years of bloodshed and torture, and Lucy's self-sacrifice is totally badass. Now that we've gone through 13 different versions of Dracula's brides, let's get to the rankings, starting from the worst and ending with the best. Now this is going to be heavily biased, so don't take it too seriously if your favorite trio isn't mine. The Monster Squad. They're nothing more than set dressing in this film, which I'm actually surprised by, because a group of tween boys seems like the perfect time to let their seductive nature shine. Plus, if they were a bit more villainous on their own, then their deaths wouldn't wind up feeling so undeserved. Bram Stoker's Dracula. The 1974 version of The Brides just falls flat, lacking any of the flirtatiousness, loneliness, or wickedness that makes them interesting. In a word, they're forgettable. Mystery and imagination. Although I'll give them props for including a black bride, the only one on this list, mind you, they're scary in a pretty run-of-the-mill way, and making them look so disheveled really misses a key aspect of their characterization. Transylvania twist. Regardless of how attractive they are, the fact that only one of these characters is actually a character is a pretty big negative in my book, and even though the point of the film is to be funny, it just doesn't work for me in the long run. Count Dracula. Keeping in mind the amount of screen time they had, this is a great interpretation of the brides, and one of the few examples that actually left me wanting more. Dracula 2000. Even though the storyline is pretty unique, once the girls turn into vampires, they aren't very interesting. Dracula. There's something about a vampire with finger waves that is so chic, and I've got to applaud them for managing to be so memorable with such little screen time. It just goes to show that sometimes less is more. Jonathan. Even though it deviates from the source material, this is probably the film that does the best job of representing the bride's loneliness, and I'm also a fan of their look, which is just as spooky as it is sweet. Count Dracula's Great Love. The best part of this movie is seeing the girls interact with each other, which makes you more invested in what will happen to them as the film progresses. I just wish they'd teamed up to kill Dracula, but admittedly, that'd make it a totally different movie. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Although this version captures how evil the brides can be, it's almost too much at times, being so monstrous that I'm not surprised Dracula is turned off by them. Sure, they're beautiful, but I'm just too much of a scaredy cat. The Invitation. Even if it's a deviation from their original characterization, I like the idea of the brides rebelling against their master. After all, who wouldn't get tired of an asshole bossing them around for all eternity? Count Dracula. If you ask me, this is probably the version of the brides that is most faithful to the novel. There's an innocence to the portrayal that makes their wickedness more shocking, and of the bunch, they'd probably have the easiest time actually luring someone to their doom. Van Helsing. This probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone who grew up watching this movie. Not only are they some of the most interesting brides individually, they also work great together as a unit, and by adding their desire for a child, it gives them a unique motivation for their actions. Also, let's just be real, they're hot as hell. Now, as I mentioned, I omitted a few versions of Dracula's brides in this ranking video, one notable example being ABC's The Brides, which took the 3 iconic beauties and moved them to New York City. With Dracula being presumed dead, each of his brides have gone their separate ways, with one being in real estate, another owning her own modeling agency, and the last being an aspiring singer whose marriage to a news reporter is threatening all of their existences. Although a pilot was filmed in 2020, the series was dropped later that year because of the pandemic, and at this point, it's unlikely it'll ever see the light of day. Now, the premise itself isn't that interesting, falling into stereotypical soap opera drama territory, but the idea of a show focused on Dracula's brides intrigues me, especially because they're such interesting characters who've never had the opportunity to stand on their own. This specific show might have been a failure, but I don't think Hollywood should give up on the concept. Not yet, at least. Which of Dracula's brides is your favorite? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!